And we also need Title IX, the courts to really establish the original intent of Title IX, which is women as a biological sex class. This is one of these things where, like, the UK's Equality Act was in 2010, but Title IX was long before then. At the time Title IX was written, it was obvious what people, it was obvious what a woman was. Everyone agreed about that. So we shouldn't even have to be having this dispute over Title IX. It's one thing to have a dispute about something that was written in 2010, but for something that always intended something to begin with, it's really disheartening that we have to have this conversation. But since we do, hopefully that will also be resolved in a way that favors biological reality. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the LGB Alliance USA News Roundup for the week ending on April 18th, 2025. We are here with Joss, Sylvia, and me, Arianne. First, a summary of the news. The U.S. Attorney General announces lawsuit against Maine over Title IX violations. The Department of Health and Human Services removes gender dysphoria from its disability list. Gay asylum seeker Andry Hernandez Romero is deported to an El Salvador prison. Fort Bend School Board changes parental notification policy for gender identity changes. The Stand with Women Act is set to be introduced in the Nebraska Senate on April 22nd. A new paper casts doubt on fertility preservation for youth undergoing medical gender transition. Hungary passes an anti-LGBTQ pride bill, and the UK Supreme Court declares that a woman only refers to a biological woman. We'll start with you, Sylvia.
Thanks, Arianne. The federal government will be suing the state of Maine for continuing to include males in women's sports, despite the Trump administration's executive order banning the practice and despite the protections of Title IX. The complaint states, by prioritizing gender identity over biological reality, Maine's policies deprive girl athletes of fair competition, deny them equal athletic opportunities, and expose them to heightened risks of physical injury and psychological harm. The Justice Department accused Maine of, quote, openly and defiantly flouting federal anti-discrimination law by enforcing policies that require girls to compete against boys in athletic competitions designated exclusively for girls. The governor of Maine, Janet Mills, issued the statement, quote, today is the latest expected salvo in an unprecedented campaign to pressure the state of Maine to ignore the Constitution and abandon the rule of law. This matter has never been about sports or the protection of women and girls, as has been claimed. It is about states' rights and defending the rule of law against a federal government bent on imposing its will instead of upholding the law. So, is this lawsuit federal government overreach, or is it ensuring the rights of females to play sports fairly and safely? That will be up to the court to decide. Next, Andry Hernandez Romero is a gay man seeking asylum in the U.S. He came to the States in August of 2024 from Venezuela, where he faced discrimination on the basis of his sexual orientation. His lawyer states, quote, he followed the rules that existed at the time for him to seek asylum legally in the United States. After arriving, Andry was held in Otay Mesa Detention Center in San Diego for months, awaiting his asylum hearing. However, when it was time for his hearing, Andry was nowhere to be found. That is because Andry had been transferred to the maximum security prison known as CCOT in El Salvador. The crown tattoos on his wrists were suspected to be signs of his affiliation with the gang Tren de Aragua. Due to the Trump administration's Alien Enemies Act, this deportation and imprisonment was done without due process. The tattoos in question, according to his family and friends, are an homage to his time on the stage in the Three Kings Festival that took place in his small hometown each year. It was at this festival where Andry's love for theater and performing arts began. You can even watch footage of him performing in that festival. Not very gang-like, if you ask me. And finally, the headlines will read, Trump administration removes gender dysphoria from disability protections. But let us clarify. In May of 2024, the Biden administration added language to the preamble of Section 504 in the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 titled Non-Discrimination on the Basis of Disability in Programs or Activities Receiving Federal Financial Assistance. This addition seemingly added gender dysphoria to the protected class of disabilities. However, due to the unclear language, and more importantly, the fact that this addition was only in the preamble and not the regulatory text, there is confusion about how this addition would be enforced. Thus, the current Health and Human Services Department issued a clarification document stating, quote, this preamble language does not have the force or effect of law. It cannot be enforced. While headlines read, Trump administration removes gender dysphoria from list of protected disabilities, rest assured, those are clickbait. Gender dysphoria was never officially a protected disability. This controversy begs the questions, should gender dysphoria be considered a disability? How would one provide the necessary accommodations for gender dysphoria to prevent discrimination? It would seem, perhaps, that the addition of gender dysphoria to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act is merely another avenue for enforcing transgender privilege under the guise of disability accommodations. Joss?
Thanks, Sylvia. Starting off in Texas, Fort Bend Independent School District, the FBISD, made news this week because of their newly approved gender identity policy. Following over an hour of public comments, the FBISD Board of Trustees approved the measure in a 5-2 vote during their April 14th meeting. The policy mandates that staff notify parents if a student adopts a new name, pronoun, or gender identity that does not align with their birth sex. It also requires students to participate in sports and use facilities based on their sex, bans staff from diagnosing gender dysphoria, mandates removal of materials promoting gender fluidity, and states that even with parental permission, no one is required to use the student's preferred pronouns. Trustee Andry Hernandez, who voted against the policy, voiced concern that the policy undermines efforts to create a supportive and safe learning environment for all students, while Trustee Rick Garcia, who voted in favor of the policy, noted the intent is to ensure parental involvement and clarity around district procedures. Some members of the community welcomed the policy as a step toward safeguarding children's dignity and privacy. And speaking of dignity and privacy, moving now to information on a bill debate in Nebraska. Those of you who receive our newsletter may recall that we put out a call to action in March, asking Nebraskans to support the Stand With Women Act, which is sponsored by Nebraska State Senator Kathleen Kauth. Senator Kauth needs 25 votes to pass the legislation, but 33 to break a filibuster. We urged Nebraskans to contact their state senators regardless of their political affiliation. But we have information that the legislation is not favorable among Democrats and that Senate Republicans in particular need to hear support from their constituency to assure them that this vote is the right one. LB 89, the Stand With Women Act, seeks to keep sports in schools, locker rooms, and restrooms as single-sex only. In my many years of reading proposed legislation, LB 89 is one of the most straightforward and balanced in reason bills that I've read. The first sections explain why such a bill is necessary, that there are immutable biological differences between males and females that provide inherent biological advantages to male athletes, and that those advantages create a significant sports performance gap between the sexes. It continues that testosterone suppression does not result in a level playing field between male and female athletes, and for safety and fairness for female athletes, separate categories are necessary. The following is provision 7 from section 2 of the bill. Quote, because of the physical differences between males and females, having separate athletic teams based on the biological sex of the athlete reduces the chance of injury to female athletes, promotes equality between the sexes, provides opportunities for female athletes to compete against their female peers rather than against male athletes, and allows female athletes to compete on a fair playing field for scholarships and other athletic accomplishments. Provision 8 from Section 2 reads, providing for separate restrooms and locker rooms for females and males advances the important governmental objective of protecting the privacy of individuals and shielding students' bodies from the opposite sex. This bill is very straightforward. There's no hidden agenda. LB 89, the Stand With Women Act, is an effort to ensure female and male athletes are treated fairly, are able to compete safely, and use the restroom and locker room based on their sex to ensure student privacy. The bill is scheduled for a 4-hour debate this Tuesday, April 22nd, with a likely start time around 3 p.m. Senator Kauth expects the debate to be lively, and support leading up to the debate and during the debate is essential. If you are near Lincoln and can physically attend and support, please consider doing so. If you can't make it in person, and for those of us outside of the state, the debate can be viewed on Nebraska Public Media, which will be linked in our show notes. As a side note, Senator Kauth is one of the most sincere, relatable, and kind state senators I've had the opportunity to engage with. Nebraskans, please call, email, and tag your state senators on social media and tell them you stand with women, that you support LB 89. And now to Arianne.
Thank you, Joss, and very well said. Now we're going to turn towards some science-related news. A paper was published on April 11th in the Frontiers in Endocrinology journal, which examined the efficacy of ART, or assisted reproductive technologies, for gender dysphoric youth treated with cross-sex hormones and/or puberty blockers. This study examined fertility preservation techniques currently used for pediatric cancer patients and considered whether they are adequate models for medicalized gender dysphoric youth. They concluded that fertility preservation techniques for childhood cancer patients are already experimental for males, and for females, its success is limited to those who already underwent some gamete maturation in puberty. Take, for example, IVM, or in vitro maturation, where immature eggs are collected and matured outside the body. As the paper states, quote, "There have been no known live births from IVM of ovarian tissue obtained in the premenarchal female children," unquote. Furthermore, the paper cites research finding that only about 5% of pediatric transition patients even attempt fertility preservation. And other papers indicate a huge number of pediatric transition patients aren't even offered counseling on fertility loss, as low as 13.5%, according to one study, though other studies show a higher figure, highlighting the number of unknowns there still are in this experimental field of medicine. On top of this, the authors of this new paper candidly admit to a key difference between pediatric cancer patients and pediatric gender dysphoria patients, namely that the former have no choice but to immediately begin cancer treatment to save themselves from a life-threatening condition, while pediatric gender dysphoria patients do not have the burden of their condition being immediately life-threatening. The paper concludes by saying, quote, "Identifying as transgender or gender diverse is not a pathological physical condition. Therefore, the medical establishment does not have the right to introduce iatrogenic medical risks to these children and adolescents that compromise their healthy physiologic function," unquote. I found this admission refreshing since so much rhetoric about gender dysphoria these days promotes the suicide myth, namely that trans-identifying youth need to medically transition ASAP to avoid suicide. So a published study advising we slow the rush to medically transition youth is welcome. And now turning to the news from Europe. On April 14th, Hungary passed a constitutional amendment authorizing the banning of LGBTQ public events. This codifies a law passed in March that banned LGBTQ gatherings, including Pride, and uses facial recognition software to recognize violators of that ban. The law declares that children's rights to moral, physical, and spiritual development override all other rights excepting the right to life, including the right to assembly. This ban is not just about repressing free speech of the TQ, but also the LGB, and it's consistent with previous moves Hungary has made. For example, in 2021, Hungary approved legislation that banned sharing content with minors that displayed sex reassignment or homosexuality. The law also amends the Constitution to say there are two sexes, male or female, defined by biology. But don't get too excited about this because this is an expansion of an earlier amendment to ban same-sex couples from adopting children. In other words, it's motivated by homophobia. This move should not surprise anyone who has been following Hungary's politics. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban has styled himself as an upholder of Europe's traditional Christian values, and many social conservatives around the world, including the US, have championed him for this reason. But Orban's critics have warned of his and his governing coalition's increasingly authoritarian behavior. I think this is an important reminder that good old-fashioned homophobia is still alive and well in much of the world, including parts of the world with weak rights to freedom of speech and assembly. And furthermore, we shouldn't assume that critics of gender identity know or care about the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. So stay vigilant. Your enemy's enemy is not necessarily your friend. Moving on to some big news from the United Kingdom. Opponents of gender ideology have scored a major victory in front of the UK Supreme Court on April 16th. The court unanimously ruled that a woman is defined strictly by biology for the sake of the interpretation of the 2010 Equality Act. The group For Women Scotland brought the case against the Scottish government, which tried to argue that males with a certificate claiming they are female deserve the same protections as biological females. The court sided with For Women Scotland, saying that a certificate of legal sex change cannot make someone a woman. The decision affects, quote, changing rooms, homeless hostels, segregated swimming areas that might be essential for religious reasons or desirable for the protection of a woman's safety or the autonomy or privacy and dignity of the two sexes, or medical or counseling services provided only to women or men. For example, cervical cancer screening for women or prostate cancer screening for men, or counseling services for women only as victims of rape or domestic violence, unquote. That said, the court still maintained that the law protects people from discrimination in housing and employment on the basis of gender identity. So, for example, an employer can't fire an employee simply for identifying as trans, nor could someone be denied housing for being trans identifying. This seems like it's a pretty straightforward, fair way forward. It maintains biological reality and protects women's rights while still finding a way to ensure that anti-discrimination laws accommodate for the growing trans-identified population. It does not pit transgender rights against women's rights, in other words. Hopefully, judges and politicians in the US will take notice. And with that, I'm curious what you two think about this news.
I think it sets an exciting precedent that hopefully the rest of the world can follow. I know the United States has been behind Europe and the UK and Scandinavian countries with medicalization and trans rights. And so when we followed in the trajectory of trans rights, now that they're kind of walking back, I'm hoping the United States will follow that. I really liked your point about saying that trans rights and women's rights are not mutually exclusive, but there is a line, and that line is defining what a woman is and women-only spaces. Logically, the next step is protecting single-sex spaces for homosexuals.
Yeah, I really like the way you put that, Sylvia. It's good to see. It's refreshing. It's good. It is a huge victory. There's so much on Instagram and Twitter of women just overjoyed at the news of this, and rightfully so. It feels very Orwellian. We talk about this often. To even be in a space where we have to have in 2025 a Supreme Court in the UK declare what a woman is, that a trans woman is a trans woman and a woman is a woman. And it's I don't see how it could be any easier to get, personally, but it feels like the upside down that we have to even be here and do it. So I'm really glad that this is the outcome. I expected it was the outcome. Hopefully this will have a positive impact for Lava, the lesbians in New Zealand who are in a limbo state with their case, trying to assert themselves and their ability to have single-sex spaces for lesbians.
Yeah, and one thing that I think was also brought up on social media, of course, there's the predictable trans rights activists that are, not happy about this ruling, but I think it's a good point to bring up that trans identified people are still protected according to their sex and their trans status. So one point that I saw brought up is if you're a female to male trans, now you get, to claim discrimination as a woman. So actually that could be seen as a boon for you. But so much of trans activism is focused on the male to female trans, the trans identified males, and how they're upset about that they can't claim being a woman anymore. And I think it just goes to show how topsy-turvy a lot of the activism in amongst trans people is, that it's so focused particularly on the on the trans identified males.
Yeah, it's a disproportionate amount of focus on males. It's nice to just make it clean, make it plain, and hopefully the US takes note as well, because our Equality Act also attempts to codify in law the conflation of sex and gender, and they have actively done that with the Violence Against Women and Girls Act. I will say this over and over again because it bothers me so much. The United States needs to pay attention, and our federal government, this is the time with this administration to take some action and to lock it down, because we need the Equality Act. We never did pass it here in the United States, but they cannot codify it. It cannot be the way that it is written presently. We need those feminist amendments that we advocated for years ago.
Yeah, and we also need Title IX, the courts to really establish the original intent of Title IX, which is women as a biological sex class. This is one of these things where, like, the UK's Equality Act was in 2010, but Title IX was long before then. At the time Title IX was written, it was obvious what people, it was obvious what a woman was. It was everyone agreed about that. So we shouldn't even have to be having this dispute over Title IX. It's one thing to have a dispute about something that was written in 2010, but for something that always intended something to begin with, it's really disheartening that we have to have this conversation. But since we do, hopefully that will also be resolved in a way that favors biological reality.
I want to thank all of the women that fought to get us here, because it was because of women that had to go through the bullshit, frankly, of being fired or of being attacked, of losing so much and fighting it in the courts until it finally got to the big court and international news and spotlight on it. It's because of the hard work that feminists and women's rights advocates, women, have fought for. And as far as Title IX being kind of walked back, as you said, Arianne, I feel like misogynists will find a loophole to take advantage and beat down women. And right as women were super close to full equality, now it's like, well, we don't even know what a woman is. So better luck next time, females. We'll get there, though. We'll get there.
Well, that was a great note to end on, Sylvia. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening, and we hope to see you again next week. Goodbye.